understanding how bacteria sense their surroundings and cause infection. In 2012, she was one of the organizers of the Harry Potter Day, Science, Magic, and Medicine, which drew 1,400 attendees. Aside from her researching, reading, talking, and writing about science, Stefanie also enjoys cooking, traveling, and curling. So, okay, welcome.
Hey, thanks everyone for coming today. You'll have to bear with me with my voice. Ironically, given the title of my talk, I'm actually sick today, but I'll do my best to kind of project and stuff. So I want to start out today with a story, and like many good stories, it features a lot of bodily functions. So this particular story is set actually inside of an intestinal tract, which belongs to one Marion Browning, who's a 79-year-old retired nurse from Rhode Island. And at the start of this story, Marion's intestinal tract is not a very happy place. She has a condition called diverticulitis, which is an inflammation of small pouches lining her colon. This is really painful, and Marion goes to her doctor to try to deal with this. So her doctor prescribes her a course of antibiotics, which is a pretty standard weaponry against these unwelcome bacteria causing the diverticulitis. And at first it seems like the antibiotics have helped. Marion starts to feel a little bit better. But then a couple weeks later, Marion gets much, much worse. She suddenly has a really severe diarrhea. And it turns out that what happened was that these antibiotics didn't just kill the diverticulitis bacteria, they killed a lot of innocent civilians as well. So the normal bacteria that normally inhabit her intestine. And this has caused a power vacuum in her intestine and made way for a new bad guy to move in. A bad guy known as Clostridium difficile, who you may refer to as C. diff. So C. diff has an arsenal of toxins that it uses to attack the intestine, and this causes bloating and inflammation and really chronic, horrible diarrhea, and is not a pleasant thing to have. So once again, Marion goes back to her doctor. Her doctor says, okay, we can deal with this, we'll just give you another round of antibiotics. At first, that seems to help a little bit. Marion's feeling a bit better. C. diff makes a little bit of a retreat, but then given some time to rebuild its forces, it comes back with full strength, and Marion is just as sick again. So this back and forth between antibiotics helping a little and the C. diff coming back continues 4 times. And meanwhile, while all this is happening, Marion is hardly able to leave her house or sometimes even her toilet. She's very sick. It seems pretty hopeless for Marion. So one day her doctor decides, let's try a new strategy in this war. Instead of using antibiotics to kill off the C. diff, let's instead invite in some new peaceful inhabitants to your intestine. And let's do this with something called a fecal transplant. So this is a procedure where doctors take a stool sample from a healthy donor, dilute out the bacteria, and then put it back into the intestine of somebody suffering from a disease like C. diff diarrhea. And lo and behold, these peaceful inhabitants thrived in Marion's intestine. They drove out the C. diff. It was never to return, and everyone lived happily ever after, except I guess for the C. diff. So this fecal transplant, it may sound crazy and kind of disgusting, but it's actually really effective. So a recent study showed that about 94% of people suffering from C. diff diarrhea who receive a fecal transplant recover completely. They have no more relapses. This is a rate that's pretty much unheard of for conventional drugs. It's very impressive. So why does this story seem so strange to us, given these amazing statistics? Well, in medicine, we're used to thinking about the pathogens, the harmful bacteria, like our friend C. diff here. We're not so much used to thinking about the other bacteria that are living in and around us. So we've developed a lot of great antibiotics for dealing with these bad guys, and they have helped amazingly in modern medicine. So diseases that used to be an absolute scourge upon society, like the bubonic plague, we pretty much don't hear of them anymore. But we need to be thinking, we're realizing more and more, about all of the other bacteria that are in and on us, because these pathogens are only a tiny proportion of the bacteria we normally see in our daily life. The other bacteria that we need to be thinking about are called the microbiome. So the microbiome is the collection of bacteria that lives in and on the human body. And there's some really amazing statistics with this. So for every 1 human cell in your body, there are 10 microbial cells in or on you right at this very moment. And if you think about the fact that you probably have hundreds or thousands of different species of microbes on you, this leads to another statistic. For every 1 human gene that you have in your own genome, these members of the microbiome have 100 microbial genes in or on your body at this moment. So you might have walked in here thinking of yourself as human, but really you're either 90 or 99% microbial. We're basically walking incubators. And these microbes, they can be found on pretty much any surface of the body that's exposed to the external environment. So obviously things like your skin, your mouth, even places like the lungs that were once thought to be sterile do host some microbes. But the place that they really, really love to live is in the intestinal tract. And in fact, the mammalian intestine is home to the most dense bacterial culture that has ever been found on Earth. It's a great place for microbes to live. So given these numbers, it's probably not surprising that these bacteria and other microbes play a really big role in our health. And you may have heard about probiotics and prebiotics. So probiotics are beneficial bacteria, and prebiotics are nutrients that are meant to support the growth of these beneficial bacteria. These have been quite a fad in the food industry lately. But it turns out that we've actually evolved natural probiotics and prebiotics to help us cultivate our microbiome and maintain our health. So first I'd like to talk about where the microbiome comes from. So human fetuses, when they're inside their mother's womb, are considered to be sterile. As far as we know, this is not a place that bacteria can normally go. So the first contact that a human baby will have with microbes is during the process of birth, as it passes through the birth canal. This might seem kind of incidental, like, the baby has to get out somehow, so of course it's just going to meet some microbes there. But there's some new studies showing that there are some very specific changes that happen during pregnancy that seem to prepare for this transfer of microbes from mother to the newborn child. So scientists have been doing a lot of studies lately where they sample different humans on different body sites and then do kind of a catalog to see what different kinds of bacteria are living there. And in one study, they took samples of the vaginal microbiota from both women who were pregnant and healthy adult women who were not pregnant. And the authors of the study even said we weren't really expecting to see a big difference, but in fact they did. They found that the bacterial communities were really different between women who were or weren't pregnant. And the women who were pregnant had a really high proportion of bacteria called lactobacillus. If this name sounds familiar to you at all, it's probably because lactobacillus species are used a lot in making yogurt, and you might find them in the probiotic supplements you can buy at the drugstore. So that kind of gives a clue right away that these are friendly, healthy bacteria. Now, the particular kind of lactobacillus that was found in the pregnant women is called Lactobacillus johnsonii. And what's kind of weird is that it's not normally associated with living in vaginas. It's usually associated with living in the intestinal tract. So this suggested to the scientists that some really specific changes, chemical or biological, are happening during pregnancy that makes the pregnant women host these intestinal probiotic bacteria that they're then going to pass on to their babies during the process of birth. So once the baby comes out and it gets covered in these lactobacillus bacteria, they can make their way into the baby's intestine, and there they'll help it to digest milk and also protect it from pathogens and things like that. We do have some evidence that this transfer of bacteria from the mother to the baby is really important for health. So some other studies have looked at the types of bacteria present in the guts of babies that were born either through traditional labor or through cesarean section. And they found that these bacterial communities are really different between the two different delivery methods. So babies born by C-section have a much less diverse community of bacteria in their intestines. And this might be linked to some other health problems that C-section babies are predisposed to later in life. So C-section babies are more likely than traditionally born babies to have things like asthma and type 1 diabetes and obesity. So we don't know for sure if the change in bacteria is what's causing this predisposition to disease. But given that 27% of Canadian babies are now being born by C-section, this is definitely something that we're going to be studying a lot more. So now after birth, we know that mother's milk is very important for nurturing the health of the baby. In many cases, that's the only kind of food that the baby receives for the first 6 months or so of life. So it has a lot of different nutrients present to support and protect the baby. So we know that there are lots of things like sugars and lipids in mother's milk that will allow the baby to grow. There's also things like antibodies to protect it from disease. But there was one component of breast milk that was really puzzling to scientists for a long time. It's something called human milk oligosaccharides, and it's just a collection of different kinds of short chains of sugars. What was puzzling about this particular component is that it's really abundant. So it's the third most abundant ingredient in breast milk, yet we know that human babies cannot digest these oligosaccharides. Humans just don't make the enzymes that are needed to break down these sugars and turn them into a source of energy or nutrients. So it was very puzzling to the scientists about why humans are going to so much effort to put all of these oligosaccharides into the breast milk when the babies can't digest them anyway. But what we now know is that these human milk oligosaccharides are actually prebiotics. So they're nutrients that support the growth of bacteria. There are certain kinds of bacteria, like bifidobacterium, which is another common yogurt bacterium, that are really good at breaking down and growing on these human milk oligosaccharides. And so what happens is that the baby's gut has a really high level of these human milk oligosaccharides, and that supports the growth of these healthy bacteria, like bifidobacterium. And these bifidobacteria take up the space and the nutrients in the intestine and kind of crowd out any other bacteria that might have come in and cause infections and problems for the baby. So as you can see, humans really go to a lot of effort to cultivate particular kinds of healthy bacteria right from the beginning of life. So, as you might expect, these bacteria do important things for us, since we're going to so much effort to keep them around. So as you might guess, since they're in the digestive system, largely, they do play an important role in digestion. And exactly what they're doing there was first discovered using studies on germ-free mice. So back in the 1930s, scientists thought, well, normal mice, really germy, just like people, they're covered in germs inside and out, but wouldn't it be great if we could find a way to study completely sterile mice that have no germs on them so we could really understand better what would be the effect of introducing one specific germ instead of having all these other random ones around. So they created a way of raising germ-free mice where they would take a pregnant mouse and they would treat her with antibiotics, they would shave off her fur and absolutely scrub her skin clean, and then they would deliver her babies in a sterile environment by C-section. So I mentioned before that fetuses are sterile inside the womb, so if they deliver the mouse babies in this way, then they're going to stay sterile. So in order to make sure that the germ-free mice don't pick up any germs later, they have to grow them in these isolators, and humans obviously can't touch them or we would give them our germs, so they use these gloves that are built into the isolators to handle the mice. They're fed sterile food and they're given sterile water, and basically they kind of live like the boy in the bubble. They have no contact with the outside world and they stay completely free of bacteria and viruses and stuff like that. Now many scientists had thought that bacteria would be really important for the growth of these mice, and they thought that these germ-free mice would just die. But that's actually not what happened. They were able to live and grow, and in fact they were hungrier than normal mice that had bacteria. So this was the first clue that maybe bacteria normally play a role in digestion. The scientists found that they had to give these sterile germ-free mice 30% more food in order for them to gain the same amount of weight as mice that had bacteria in them. And what's more, they had to supplement that food with certain vitamins like vitamin B and vitamin K in order to make sure that these mice could grow. So why is this? Well, it turns out that microbes do play a really important role in digestion. Now, both humans and mice tend to eat a lot of plant-based foods, and plant foods have a lot of complex carbohydrates in them. So things like starches and fibers. And our bodies are really pathetically bad at digesting these. Like, we have a really measly number of enzymes that can be used to break down those carbohydrates and turn them into some kind of fuel for the body. So that means that in general, plant foods tend to kind of go in one end and out the other. for humans and for mice, because we're just so bad at digesting them. However, as I mentioned earlier, the bacteria in our guts have many, many more genes than we have in our own genome. And this means that a lot of these bacteria make different kinds of enzymes that they can use to break down these carbohydrates, enzymes that we don't have encoded in our genomes. So what can happen is, for example, a type of bacteria called Bacteroides theta iota omicron, which is always fun to say, it's really good at breaking down a lot of different kinds of sugars. It has hundreds of different enzymes for this. So it breaks down the sugars and uses them as energy for its own growth, and then it excretes a type of waste product called short-chain fatty acids. So sometimes what's one bacterium's waste is another man's treasure. So in this case, our bodies can absorb those short-chain fatty acids, the bacterial excrement, and we use those as food. So this means that we can actually get some calories out of those plant carbohydrates that we aren't able to break down on our own. And this is why having bacteria in our guts allows us to consume about 30% less food than we otherwise would have to. In addition to that, there are some other bacteria that live in our large intestine, which are responsible for making vitamins, and particularly vitamin K is one that you normally never have to take a supplement for. It's not something that you normally see a lot of people buying at the store. And that's because we all have bacteria in our guts that make that vitamin for us. So you can imagine how this would have been a really huge benefit back in the hunter-gatherer times to have these bacteria present in your guts. That if you could spend 30% less time hunting or 30% less time gathering, that could mean the difference between life and death in a situation where nutrients are limited. Now, times have changed and our diets have definitely changed. So nowadays, it's not so much a difference between life and death that our gut bacteria are causing for us. It's sometimes a difference between being a normal weight and being overweight. Now, some really interesting studies have been done recently on the link between gut bacteria and obesity. And a lot of these were done in mice. And I just had to show a picture of this because I think they're kind of adorable and hilarious. But these studies were done using, here's a normal mouse, and here's a mouse that has a genetic mutation that causes it to be obese. So scientists looked at the kind of gut bacteria present in these two different types of mice, and they saw that there were a lot of differences, which is probably not all that surprising. But what they did next was really cool. So they took some of the bacteria present in the guts of the lean mice and some present in the guts of the obese mice, and they transplanted those bacteria into two groups of germ-free mice, which didn't have any of their own bacteria to start with. And what they found was that the germ-free mice that received bacteria from the obese mice actually gained more weight than the germ-free mice that received bacteria from the lean mice. So this shows that the microbes can actually play a causal role in obesity, and having certain types of microbes in your gut can cause you to put on more weight than you otherwise would. This is probably because those particular microbes are better at breaking down nutrients in food, and they're allowing you to take more calories out of your food than you would be able to on your own. So I haven't seen anything about this yet, but my prediction is that the diet industry is going to be catching on to this anytime now. And I think it's a pretty safe bet that within 5 or 10 years, we're going to be seeing custom probiotics to help you lose weight. Because theoretically, if you can fill up your own intestine with the kinds of bacteria that are present in the lean mouse, compared to the obese mouse bacteria, you're not going to be able to extract as many calories from your food, and that can help you out with weight loss. Okay, I'd like to talk about one other role for our beneficial bacteria, and this relates to the immune system. So going back to the germ-free mice, scientists found that they also had problems, in addition to needing to eat more food, they also had a tendency to develop colitis, which is an inflammation of the colon. And they did this at a much higher rate than bacteria that had, or that mice that had bacteria, rather. But what was really interesting was that if you give these germ-free mice certain bacteria, like a guy called Bacteroides fragilis, this colitis would go away and would be completely cured. So it really did seem to be something linked to the presence or absence of these bacteria that was affecting this autoimmune disease, this colitis. So through further studies, what we found is that the immune system is really shaped by bacteria in a large way. So the immune system has to maintain this really steady balance in between immunity and tolerance. So when we're talking about immunity, that's the ability of the immune system to recognize and attack bad guys, pathogens, right? So bacteria and viruses and things like cancer cells, things that shouldn't be in your body, it's your immune system's job to get rid of them. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that are supposed to be in your body, like your own cells. Some things like allergens, peanuts should be fine to have in your body. And your healthy bacteria should be allowed there as well. So your immune system doesn't want to attack those guys because that's just going to make you sick. It'll give you allergies or autoimmune diseases or something like that. So it's really important for your immune system to have this balance. And now we know that bacteria in the gut are really important for propping up this tolerance arm of the immune system. So Bacteroides fragilis that I mentioned earlier on, how it does this is it stimulates the immune system to produce more of a kind of cell called regulatory T cells. And these are kind of like the police of the immune system. So they make sure that these these T cells that are involved in controlling infections and stuff like that don't get to be over-aggressive and start attacking our own cells. So the T regulatory cells are really important for this tolerance side of the immune system. And it's the presence of bacteria that allows them to be present in adequate amounts for them to do that. So we do have some indications, not just from mice, but also from people, that the gut bacteria are important for this balance of the immune system. And so for this, I'll use the example of inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease. Scientists have found that the type of bacteria present in the intestines of people with Crohn's disease is actually different from people who don't have Crohn's disease. We don't know for sure yet if this is a cause or an effect of having Crohn's disease. So with all that inflammation in the intestine, is it just causing different kinds of bacteria to grow there? Or are these different kinds of bacteria the ones that are starting the inflammation in the first place? We haven't quite resolved that question, but what I have seen is that there are a lot of different pharmaceutical and biotech companies that are now working on probiotic and prebiotic treatments for Crohn's disease. So that will probably be a big way of treating these autoimmune diseases in the future, is that you could administer bacteria that will help to prop up this tolerance part of the immune system. What I think is really interesting is that gut bacteria have effects on the immune system which go even beyond the intestine itself. So it's not just inflammatory bowel diseases that are affected here, it's other kinds of immune diseases like asthma. Going back to mice, it's been found that if you give mice a really high dose of antibiotics when they're very young, that both changes their gut bacteria and also predisposes them to developing asthma. And people have seen a really similar correlation in humans, that babies that received antibiotics are also more likely to develop asthma. So this suggests that there are probably some bacteria somewhere in our body, likely in the gut, that normally protect us from diseases like asthma, but these antibiotics are wiping out, and this is what is predisposing so many kids these days to developing asthma. And that is really exciting because it opens the door to actually developing a probiotic kind of treatment that would prevent asthma. Maybe there's a type of bacteria we could give to young children that would stop them from ever developing asthma in the first place. So although some of these treatments sound kind of crazy and kind of disgusting, especially fecal transplants, they are in general pretty effective. And in the future, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more bacterial-based treatments for things like weight loss and autoimmune diseases and asthma. In general, I think what we have realized in the past 10 years or so of research is that we really need to be a lot more probiotic and a lot less antibiotic. So that's all I have to say, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Great, yeah, I haven't heard of any kinds of treatments like that. Definitely the medical community is aware of this problem, so that's one of the reasons that most doctors will counsel women not to have elective cesarean sections unless, there's like actual medical reason for the C-section, because they know that you do have a predisposition to these problems. But I think with time, probably we will be seeing that kind of treatment for the babies that do need to be born by C-section.
Just two things. The fecal transplant, I watched the program a little while about this, and I just can't remember. I think that was first done in Canada, correct? This first successful fecal transplant?
I'm not sure. So in my research, I found that behind the scenes, doctors have been doing stuff like this for about 50 years, but nobody knew about it. So I think it's probably kind of hard to say where the first one was done. It's been kind of an underground thing for a long time, but definitely there's a lot of research.
I guess I could understand. The second part is, has anybody started doing any kind of transplants with bacteria in any other part of the body? Like, are there any tests, like, just skin to skin or something like that for any other conditions?
I haven't heard of any, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see that. So the majority of the research that's happening right now is really with the gut bacteria, because there's so many of them, and so we think they probably affect so many different things in our bodies. But I'm sure with time we'll be seeing skin treatments and stuff too. Yeah.
Is there any correlation between the tolerance and gluten sensitivity? Not necessarily celiac, but gluten sensitivity.
Yeah. So from what I've heard, people don't really understand very well what the cause of gluten sensitivity is. So that probably makes it hard to say, but it's not just asthma or just Crohn's disease that the immune system is involved in. So I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, but given we don't really know what the cause of gluten sensitivity is, it's hard to say right now. Yeah.
On a practical everyday note, so for a healthy person who eats a healthy diet, is there any evidence that there's a benefit of eating probiotic yogurt?
Okay, so the evidence with probiotics is kind of iffy. So a lot of the organisms that are used in probiotics right now are not natural inhabitants of our gut. So people have seen that if you take probiotics, the bacteria in the probiotics can hang around your intestines for about 2 weeks or so, but then if you stop taking those supplements, they'll go away. So, it's mostly anecdotal right now, I think, and what really needs to happen for these therapies to be more effective is we need to start looking for the bacteria that can really survive there long term, because the kinds of bacteria we're using now are really chosen not based on how well they can survive in the intestine, but how well they survive the manufacturing and packaging and shelf life kind of process. Yeah.
Is there any evidence of danger to eating too much probiotics?
I haven't heard of any. Really, if you think about it, for people who actually have bacteria present in their intestine and they're not germ-free bubble boys or whatever, probably not too many of the bacteria that you take in with probiotics are going to both survive going through your acidic stomach and then actually be able to find a home to live and grow in your intestines. So I don't know for sure of any research on whether there's a too high of a dose, but I wouldn't really expect that there would be. I think if you took in too many that more than could survive, they would just kind of die, and that would be fine. Yeah.
Just building on the same idea, I heard that take a probiotic with an antibiotic, especially for women, that it decreases their chances of getting yeast infection.
Yeah.
So is that something that, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I've heard the same thing too, and I'm a little bit curious about how that works, right? Because it's usually people eating yogurt or something, and then it seems to be having an effect on a totally different body site, right, with the yeast infection. So I've heard that too. I don't actually know how it works. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Are there any natural sources of probiotics that they don't have to do?
Yeah, I mean, for most people who aren't suffering from a disease or who haven't just taken antibiotics, you probably have all the probiotic bacteria you already need inside of you, right? So any kind of food that's fermented will have a lot of microorganisms in it. So yogurt is the one that's usually given, but beer mostly has yeast though, not bacteria. Also sauerkraut would be another example of foods, yeah.
What about just with raw foods?
Yeah.
Like bacteria is beneficial.
Yes, so that's probably true. So that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Cooking your foods, because we usually do that to kill the bad bacteria so we don't get foodborne infections, but you are going to kill most of the good bacteria when you cook your foods as well. There are some certain good bacteria that can make structures called spores. So you might have heard of these with like anthrax, which is not a good bacteria, but it makes spores which are like really resistant. And so there are some good bacteria that can make these spores, and that would probably survive cooking. But in general, yes, cooking would decrease beneficial bacteria.
Okay, I have another question. Some people they have to take like vitamin B12, and here with some people they shouldn't take it because it's actually created in our blood, and vitamins that are actually created in our body. And I hear that like it's side effect if you take it and then stop taking it, then kind of screws up your system when it comes to developing.
Yeah, I don't know too much specifically about vitamin B12. There are certain B vitamins that your gut bacteria naturally make. I'm not sure if B12 is one of them.
I just heard something.
Yeah.
Maybe one more.
Okay. One more?
Yeah, I was just wondering what your take on the whole leaky gut thing is. I've seen a lot of legitimate science about it and a lot of quackery, and I guess it kind of relates back to the gluten problem. Is that, I don't know if that's even close to your field or whatever, but...
I'm not sure if I know what leaky gut, is that what it is?
Yes, it's basically like increased intestinal permeability, so
Okay.
a leak of good and bad things in the bloodstream.
Yeah. So that's a real thing, and that has a lot to do with kind of that balance between like immunity and tolerance, and gut bacteria do play a role in this. So when you have a lot of inflammation happening in your intestine, that does make it leakier. That is true, and that can play a role in things like celiac disease, right? Allowing contents of the intestine to come in contact with the other tissue. And there have been shown that there are certain kinds of bacteria that make the gut less leaky. I don't know for sure what types of bacteria those are, but it's a real thing. I'm just not sure if everything that's attributed to it is actually